Thank you so much. Please sit down. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I join in wishing each and every one of you here Happy Democracy Day. I think it is auspicious that as part of the celebration of Democracy Day, today, June 12th, we spare time to discuss how important strong democratic institutions are and how best to bring about required reforms for stronger democratic institutions in contemporary Nigeria. I appreciate the honor done to me by the organizers of this event with the invitation to participate in this discussion and make a presentation on required reforms for stronger democratic institutions in Nigeria. The Platform Nigeria has been making commendable work in organizing discourses on crucial matters of national importance and generating ideas and recommendations that add value to Nigeria's national progress and development. It is a great pleasure to be invited to join the discussion this year and have the opportunity to discuss a crucial issue to Nigerian democratic development, namely strengthening our country's weak and fragile democratic institutions. One of the main challenges which Nigeria faces relates to how to prevent what scholars call reversal to authoritarian rule in the context of epileptic democratization since 1999, when we commenced transition from authoritarian military rule to civic democratic rule. To be sure, we have been 26 years in this transition process, which in the context of our unenviable national history of coups and counter-coups between 1966 to 1999 is indeed a record. But the governance trajectory we seem to have taken has restrained our country from making serious progress from mere rule by civilians to desirable democratic rule and good democratic governance. It is regrettable that after such a long time in transition to democratic rule, rather than democratic consolidation, authoritarian reversal is hanging over the country like the sword of Damocles. This is essentially because, paradoxically, as just yesterday, Godwin Onu observed in a publication, supposedly Democrats have become a threat to democracy in our country. Quite often, rule by civilians who are elected is often confused with democracy, but it isn't necessarily so. Civil rule is no doubt a necessary condition, but it isn't a sufficient condition for democratic development. As many scholars have long observed, no nation can build and sustain democracy without democrats, i.e., civilians who understand what democracy is, who imbibe its values and orientation, who respect democratic institutions, and who operate within the context of basic tenets of democracy. And as many commentators have also long observed, what we have in Nigeria since May 29, 1999 as democracy has increasingly become democracy, characterized by the desperate politicians who struggle to win elections by any means necessary and who, when in power, recklessly misgovern, preoccupied with pursuit of self-serving objectives, essentially irresponsible and irresponsive to the needs and aspirations of the electorate and the citizens of our country. As to what to do under the circumstances, we need to train and reorient cadres of Democrats. We need to recruit good, decent people into politics, and we need to build and strengthen strong democratic institutions which are resilient and which can withstand and checkmate authoritarian predilections, and by so doing, catalyze good democratic governance that can satisfy the needs and aspirations of the Nigerian electorate and citizens. In what follows, I commence with conceptualization of democratic institutions, discuss characteristics of these institutions, the types of these institutions, and reforms that are needed so as to strengthen them, make them independent, and more efficient and effective in the discharge of their responsibilities, particularly pertaining to sustainable democratic development that is beneficial to citizens and to our country as a whole. In conceptualizing democratic institutions, I begin by an observation that democratic institutions are organizations and structures that support and uphold democratic principles, values, and practices. They play a crucial role in ensuring that power is distributed fairly and citizens' rights are protected. They help to promote good democratic governance, nurture stability and trust, facilitate economic growth, and support human development. In doing all these, democratic institutions have the following desirable key characteristics. Accountability. They are and they have to be accountable to the people and transparent in decision-making. Rule of law. They have to uphold the rule of law and ensure that all citizens are equal before the law and the laws are applied fairly. Separation of powers. They often have separation of powers, dividing authority among different branches of government, executive, legislative, and judiciary. And democratic institutions help to promote accountability, transparency, and the rule of law, ultimately leading to more just and equitable governance. When we examine the nature and the character of democratic institutions in Nigeria as they have evolved since May 29, 1999, it is clear to my mind that necessary reforms to strengthen them have to be contemplated, and all citizens need to be involved in protecting and defending democratic institutions so that they can serve the citizens and the people of our country rather than those politicians who are actively involved in politics for self-serving objectives. The key democratic institutions that need to be strengthened through necessary reforms in Nigeria, I identify them as follows. The legislatures at both the federal and the state levels, the judiciary, the election management bodies at both the federal and state levels, political parties, even press and the media, and of course the executive branch itself. With regards to the legislatures, I think the primary role of legislatures at the federal and state levels are making legislations, appropriations, and doing oversight on implementation of government policies, programs, and projects. And they do this so as to ensure good purpose, value for money, and transparency and accountability in governance. The capacity of Nigerian legislatures to discharge these functions efficiently and effectively, of course, leaves much to be desired. And they need to be repositioned and strengthened. They need to be reformed to withstand pressures and inducements from the executive branch of government, which they should hold accountable, but to which they have become pliant, subservient, and complicit. Indeed, they have become very self-serving with the phenomenon of budget padding and the humongous allowances and reckless and the insensitive expenditures which they incur amidst generalized poverty among the citizenry. Indeed, as part of the process of reforming and strengthening the legislatures for efficiency and effectiveness, as well as cost effectiveness, a strong rational case can be made for both reducing the size of the federal and state legislatures as well as making their work part-time with reduced emoluments. The Nigerian judiciary, which is the second institution that I focus on, has experienced regrettably declining independence and respectability in the 26 years of democratization in court. They have inadequate funding, they have become susceptible to pressures, some even say to inducement by the executive branch at both the federal but especially at the state levels. They are overworked, and the recruitment process is said to be bastardized by cronyism and inadequate or inappropriate vetting, and the selection without regard to competence or integrity. The Nigerian judiciary needs to be urgently reformed. Globally, the judiciary is said to be the last bastion of hope for the common man. In the Nigerian context, it is really far, far, far from being the bastion of hope for the common man. So we need to urgently find ways and means to reform and reposition the judiciary so it can play effective, non-partisan and impartial role, as well as be speedy in the dispensation of justice, especially with regards to election disputes. It should be made mandatory that all elections disputes are resolved before swearing in of elected executives. Contradictory orders and injunctions issued by courts of competent jurisdiction should also be proscribed. There should also be speedy determination of pre-election matters. A situation in which a pre-election matter can last 3-4 years before it is addressed, long after the wrongly sworn in person has been there, is terrible. I recall a case when I was at INEC, somebody elected in 2011, and the pre-election dispute lasted until 2014. And by that time, he had been a member of the National Assembly, receiving all the perquisites. But the good thing was that the judge who determined the case said that that person must refund all the payments that had been made to him. But of course, knowing our legislature, I doubt that if anything happened to the government. The third institution, a democratic institution, is the Electoral Commission, or what we can call the election management bodies at both the federal and the states. Election management bodies or electoral commissions, which are independent, impartial, and prepare for and conduct elections with integrity, are necessary institutions at the core of desirable and sustainable democratic development and, of course, good democratic governance. In Nigeria, INEC, the Independent National Electoral Commission, and CX, the State Independent Electoral Commissions, which prepare for and conduct elections at the federal and state levels, respectively, are persistently bedeviled by many challenges, which, in spite of strenuous reform efforts to address, continue to undermine and or question the integrity and credibility of elections. More reforms are required to further strengthen the independence and the role of EMBs in Nigeria to engender the quest for free, fair, and credible elections. In this regard, the following additional reform measures are necessary and desirable and should be given urgent attention. 1, there is need for increase in the use of technology in elections for transparency and accountability. For example, there is also the need to improve upon the provisions of Electoral Act 2022 to make electronic transmission of results mandatory. 2, there is need to ensure transparent testing of electoral technologies, because a lot of lack of public trust relates to the haphazard manner in which they were introduced without popular participation in the testing of these equipments before they are deployed to the field. It's very, very important that there is a transparent process of civil engagement in testing these equipments before they are deployed. Thirdly, there is also need to clarify ambiguities pertaining to the provision in the 2022 Electoral Act regarding electronic transmission of results. For example, there is need to remove ambiguity in Section 64 of the Electoral Act in respect of the stages for comparing physical and electronic results. 4, there is need to review the appointment process for INEC chairman, national commissioners, and resident electoral commissioners in order to remove or at least minimize executive presidential influence and interference in the electoral process. And certainly doing this will further strengthen the independence of the electoral commissions. Justice Mohammed Dawal Uwais, who unfortunately died last Friday, former Chief Justice of the Federation, chaired the Electoral Reform Commission, and there were very good recommendations in that report about how to appoint the chairman, the resident electoral commissioners of INEC by minimizing political interference, by ensuring that even the perception of he who pays the piper dictates the tune would be eliminated if we sanitize the appointment process. It is not necessarily so that persons appointed by the president may turn around and do the bidding of those who appointed them. But the perception in Nigeria is so deep, even now, that whoever appoints is likely to manipulate. So we need to avoid even that perception by having a very transparent process, people with integrity, who are impartial, who are non-partisan, and who can withstand the pressure and the inducements from our very reckless politicians, particularly those in governance, in executive positions. 5, there is also need to professionalize other INEC appointments, such as resident electoral commissioners at the state level, to permit INEC as a commission to be responsible for hiring and firing this. And I can tell you, when I was in INEC, there were some resident electoral commissioners who were appointed by Mr. President as I was appointed by Mr. President. And they therefore felt that they are not accountable to the commission or to me as the chairman, because they think that they have another power base. And the only way we could manage those reckless people who believe that their power backers would protect them is, when it comes to election, send them on holiday and bring other people to conduct the elections. So, but I think the best thing is that while the appointment process of the chairman and the commissioners is made very transparently and with minimal role by the president and the chief executive, and there are many African countries that have a very transparent process of appointing chairmen and commissioners of electoral commissions. So we must learn from those and try to do it, and at least that will make our electoral commissions more independent, more credible. People with integrity will be brought in. And once you do that, then you allow the commission to appoint lower level officials and to fire them, give them the power to hire and fire. So then political parties, that's the I have so many. Maybe I will just do political parties because I don't want to take too much time. Political parties provide, we must ensure, we all know the challenges of our political parties, the incredible power of so-called, what do we call them, godfathers or money bags that control political recruitment process in terms of who are fielded to office, who contest elections, and making, basically, removing any democratic content in the internal affairs of political parties, and particularly in terms of the conduct of primaries and the appointments, selection of candidates who run for election. So it's very, very important that we pay attention to that. And I think that it's important, for example, to ensure that political parties are up and doing in many fundamental respects. One area is to ensure that there are sanctions to restrict the application of all political parties who fail to submit register of members 30 days before the primaries. The electoral management bodies, particularly at the federal level, are expected to monitor party primaries to ensure compliance, but political parties literally refuse to provide the register of members for those who are participating in the primaries. And if you don't have a register of members, you don't know whether the people who come as delegates are actually members of political parties or people who are recruited and paid to come and participate in the process. So I think that fundamental deliberate omission by political parties, which constrain the monitoring role of the electoral commissions, need to be addressed. There must be penalties for parties who refuse to provide, as the law requires, their register of members for the purpose of monitoring primaries at least 30 days before the election. We must also, and this is a very, very dangerous phenomenon that is undermining the integrity of our elections. We need to proscribe cross-carpeting, particularly for elected executives and the legislatures. And we need to empower the Electoral Commission at the federal level and at CX at the state level to prepare for and conduct by-elections as soon as they have evidence about elected people cross-carpeting. The challenge in the existing legislation is that while the law categorically says that if you cross-carpet, you lose your seat, but another provision in the law says that INEC can only conduct elections to fill the vacancies when their seats are declared vacant by the speakers of either the State Assembly or the Federal House of Representatives or the Senate President. Now, invariably, these people move from smaller parties into the parties that are already in control of the legislatures, and they refuse to declare the seats vacant. And it's just impunity, really, in the ways and the manners in which they address this. And I will not mention names, but at INEC, I took interest in how the Senate was trying to protect a senator who won an election under a small party, relatively small party, but once he got to Senate and was sworn in, he now quickly cross-carpeted to the major party in control of the Senate. Luckily, that small party was in control of the state. So they now made a lot of noise, put a lot of pressure, and the Senate president had to take the matter to the ethics committee of the Senate. And they now wrote to INEC whether there is a crisis in the party that compelled that senator to cross-carpet. And we went, I took interest because I knew it is impunity. So we went and we proved to the Senate Ethics Committee that there was no crisis in that party. And therefore, they should just authorize, that they declare the seat vacant so that the election can be conducted. It never happened. They just ignored it. And that's now why we are seeing the impunity now. You see now even elected governors are decamping into other parties 2 years into their tenure. So we really need to address this issue of cross-carpeting and decamping by elected officials. Thirdly, we also need to strictly regulate campaign finances and, if possible, have an agency to monitor and enforce penalties. INEC is doing so much. That's why late Justice Uwe's committee recommended what they call unbundling of the Electoral Commission, because it has so much to do, and it's so spread that it can't do a lot of these things effectively. Monitoring campaign finances. There was a few electoral commissions that are very good in doing that. I think the Indian Electoral Commission is very good in doing that. But in Nigeria, INEC is to do that, to also prosecute electoral offenders and so on and so forth. So I believe if we want to make strict monitoring and regulation of campaign finances, we need to take that responsibility away from the Electoral Commission and give it to another agency. And that was what the Waste Committee considered and called as unbundling of INEC, so that it can concentrate on preparation and conduct of elections. Quickly, press and the media. I think we need to strengthen the capacity and independence of the media to report responsibly by ensuring strict compliance with the Freedom of Information Act and with stiff penalties for non-compliance. We also need to introduce stiff penalties against irresponsible reportage, especially deliberate and willful circulation of misleading and false information and hate speeches. We also need to encourage the creation and signing of codes of conduct by journalists, by proprietors of print and broadcast and electronic media, and we also need to ensure strict compliance of this. Now, the executive branch. The Nigerian executive branch is arguably the most active, if not the most important of the three branches of government. And in many countries, it is so, relative to the other branches. But in Nigeria, it is responsible for policy formulation, policy execution in terms of programs and projects, planning and implementation, as well as in enforcing laws and maintenance of law and order in the country. Ideally, the executive branch works together with the judicial and legislative arms of government, sharing power and serving as checks and balances in promoting good democratic governance and accountability. In Nigeria, however, largely because of a long history of military rule, the executive branch has become a behemoth, overdeveloped relative to the other two branches, and relatively more inefficient and unaccountable, and exercising what one would call bad influence on the other two branches of government, which appear to lack the capacity or inclination to check and balance its power. The powers of the executive branch generally, and that of the presidency at the federal level and governors at the state level, need to be curtailed more effectively. Its activities and functions or discharge of responsibilities made much more transparent and accountable. And reforming this branch of government should begin with the following, in my view. Removing the immunity for governors from prosecution. Because really this immunity has made some of them, maybe even many of them, to be more reckless and unaccountable in the way in which they manage public resources at the state level. 2, making the management of security votes much more transparent and accountable. Thirdly, sanitizing appointment of assistants, special assistants, senior special assistants, special advisors, and so on. A situation in which a governor or president could appoint 400 special advisors and so on and so forth is clearly wasteful. It's clearly patronage. It has nothing to do with service in terms of efficiency or accountability, or even in terms of prudence in the management of public resources. The seventh issue I want to talk about is voting rights and inclusivity. It's not an institutional issue, but it is something that can help in improving the competence and activities of our democratic institutions. So I won't say much about this, but certainly nobody will doubt that there is need for increased representation of women, of youth, and some would say even with persons with disabilities, by creating quotas for them in representative assemblies. In conclusion, and thank you for your patience, there are many things a country such as Nigeria, with several decades of bastardization of democratic development and facing the possibility of authoritarian reversal, can do to reposition itself and pursue the path and trajectory of sustainable democratization and democratic development. These include nurturing, imbibing, and entrenching democratic political culture and reorientation among the citizenry, building new generation of democrats, and building and strengthening democratic institutions, which I paid greater attention to in this presentation. Remarkable democratic value addition that can contain authoritarian rules and bring about good democratic governance could best be got by undertaking essential reforms that are targeted at building and strengthening critical democratic institutions in the country. This may seem a difficult undertaking, but it is not impossible to do so. In any case, it is a necessary task that must be done. Thank you very much.